disease ini merupakan penyakit yang kronik dan progresif. Sehingga jika kita tidak tangani secara dini, maka tentu saja sign and symptomnya akan makin parah dan penanganannya pun akan menjadi lebih sulit. Untuk sign and symptom yang kita perlu ketahui, yang pertama adalah dari keluhan klinisnya ya. Untuk gejala-gejalanya biasanya bisa berupa heaviness, ya, perasaan berat, terutama biasanya pada saat pasien berdiri lama atau sudah berjalan lama. Kemudian bisa juga ada burning, aching, pain juga. Bahkan juga kadang-kadang ada perasaan seperti gatal atau cramping. Ya, itu yang perlu kita curigai adanya venous insufficiency. Secara tanda kita juga bisa melihat adanya perubahan-perubahan pada fisik pasien. Yang pertama adalah bisa varicose vein. Sebelumnya mungkin kita bisa temukan reticular vein atau telangiectasis. Kemudian juga ada skin changes, baik tekstur, color, and juga ditemukan rash atau hiperpigmentasi. Kemudian ada swelling dan juga ada ulcer and open sores. Nah, ini CHIP classification yang mungkin juga sejawat semua sudah pada tahu ya, sudah sering mendengarkan dan melihat. Ini merupakan salah satu klasifikasi yang bisa digunakan untuk melihat klinis pasien dan juga bertujuan pada terapi dan juga research purposes ya. Ada C0, 1, 2, C3, C4, ABC, kemudian C5 dan C6, C7. Kemudian dari clinical manifestation kita juga bisa lihat etiologiknya, apakah dia di congenital, primary, secondary seperti post-traumatic syndrome. Kemudian dari anatomic classification ya, apakah mengenai superficial, perforating atau deep vein, dan pathophysiology classification ya, apakah reflux, obstruction atau keduanya. Nah, satu lagi juga mungkin yang kadang terlewat adalah scoring system yang kita kenal dengan Revised Venous Clinical Severity Score, di mana Revised Venous Clinical Severity Score ini selain untuk menilai severitas pada saat diagnostik, dia juga bertujuan atau dapat digunakan untuk sebagai parameter evaluasi dari treatment kita. Tentu saja untuk diagnostik, kita ketahui bahwa Doppler ultrasound merupakan salah satu primary diagnostic tools yang bisa kita gunakan untuk mendiagnostik dari CVI ya. Selain juga bisa melihat walls, kemudian melihat function, kita juga bisa melihat adanya oklusi atau trombus pada pembuluh vena ya. Selain itu juga Doppler ini juga bisa kita gunakan untuk mapping pada saat pre-tindakan intervention. Untuk kita grading refluxnya secara umum kita bisa melihat sebetulnya yang paling penting adalah kita melihat ada signifikan reflux atau tidak. Jika di deep vein maka signifikan refluxnya itu adalah di atas 1 second atau 1000 milisecond. Sedangkan untuk di superficial vein, signifikan reflux itu jika di atas 0,5 second. Pemeriksaannya tentu saja sangat lebih baik dilakukan jika pasien berdiri ya. Dan kita bisa lakukan dengan beberapa manuver. Yang pertama adalah manual compression atau dengan squeeze, dan juga kita bisa lakukan dengan falsafah. Nah, falsafah ini sangat sensitif atau lebih baik digunakan pada pembuluh darah yang mendekati sumbu tubuh, jadi seperti di femoral atau di SFC. Kemudian untuk squeeze itu sendiri, kalau untuk proximal vein kita lakukan squeeze di sekitar paha atau betis, sedangkan untuk di daerah yang lebih distal atau untuk calf vein kita bisa dilakukan di kaki atau di betis bagian bawah ya. Oke, kita lebih fokus ke dalam konservatif treatment pada pasien-pasien CVI. Yang pertama, kita akan membahas mengenai conservative treatment untuk pasien-pasien CVD ya. Conservative treatment ini meliputi physical methods, kemudian compression dan pharmacological. Untuk physical methods, yang paling penting adalah kita harus menghindari hal-hal yang bisa memperberat kondisi dari venous hypertension. Yang pertama adalah avoiding prolonged standing. Jadi kita jangan berdiri terlalu lama ya. Kita sarankan pada pasien untuk sering mengganti posisi. Yang kedua, pada saat istirahat kita bantu alirannya vena kembali ke jantung dengan cara mengistirahatkan kaki dengan sedikit dielevasikan. Kemudian setelah itu juga kita maksimalkan frequent walk ya, jadi kita minta pasien untuk jalan lebih sering, terutama untuk meningkatkan kerja dari otot betis yang bisa membantu aliran dari vena dalam sehingga mengurangi venous hypertension. Kemudian juga kita hindari heat exposure, kemudian juga kita weight loss ya, sarankan untuk menurunkan berat badan, dan yang paling penting juga adalah physical exercise. Jadi kalau sejauh sekalian memiliki pasien-pasien dengan CVI, jangan lupa kita juga harus menyarankan untuk physical exercise ya, dengan target utamanya adalah lower limb muscle strength dan ankle mobility. Ini beberapa caranya adalah dengan yang pertama ankle mobilization, pasien diminta untuk duduk, kemudian mengangkat kaki ke atas dan menggerakkan ankle-nya ya secara berputar. Kemudian setelah itu ada heel raise, ya, seperti berjinjit-jinjit sambil duduk. Kemudian toe raise, ya, jempolnya diangkat. Kemudian knee raise dan juga leg raise. Ini adalah exercise yang bisa kita sarankan kepada pasien untuk melakukan physical methods di pasien-pasien dengan CVI. Setelah itu ada compression. Kita juga tahu compression ini juga merupakan salah satu cornerstone treatment dalam CVI. Ini bisa masuk dalam segala stage dari CVI dan terbukti memiliki secara klinis maupun penelitian bahwa dia mampu meningkatkan atau mengurangi simptom dan mencegah terjadinya mencegah untuk terjadinya simptom yang lebih berat. Ada beberapa modalitas yang bisa kita gunakan. Mungkin yang paling sering kita tahu adalah elastic compression stocking dengan graduated elastic compression stocking. Selain itu juga kita ada juga yang disebut dengan adjustment compression garments dan juga intermittent pneumatic compression yang tentunya penggunaannya tergantung dari klinisnya ya. Kemudian biasanya yang kita gunakan itu bisa ada dua ya, ada yang sampai knee dan juga sampai lipat paha ya atau inguinal. Namun paling sering digunakan adalah yang dengan knee length compression. Kenapa? Salah satunya juga adalah untuk meningkatkan compliance dari pasien sendiri. Kemudian yang paling penting juga kita harus tahu adalah pada pasien-pasien yang akan mendapatkan compression stocking, kita harus pastikan tidak ada severe concomitant arterial disease ya. Itu juga penting. Kemudian selain itu kita mungkin juga sering di praktek klinis sehari-hari ketika kita mau meresepkan compression stocking, kita minta pasiennya sendiri untuk ya udah datang ke tempat alat kesehatan, nanti akan diukur di sana. Tapi perlu kita tahu juga bahwa pengukuran alat itu ada dua jenis. Yang pertama adalah metrical atau ukurannya, jadi apakah dia S, M, L dan lain-lain. Dan yang kedua yang paling penting adalah dari pressure compressionnya ya, yang kita kenal dengan CCL1, CCL2, CCL3. Yang membedakannya adalah kemampuan atau kekuatan dari tensionnya. Ada yang 20-30, 30-40, 40-50 dan seterusnya. Yang juga sebetulnya digunakan tergantung dari derajat berat dari CVI itu sendiri. Jika masih dalam yang ringan mungkin cukup dengan CCL1, dengan edem atau ulcer bahkan butuh CCL2 atau CCL3. Sekali lagi, length-nya mungkin di sekitar knee length dulu untuk meningkatkan adherence dari pasien. Dan khusus untuk yang setelah mengalami venous intervention, ini disarankan untuk menggunakan sampai inguinal sampai 2 minggu. Ya. Dan kekuatannya juga perlu kita perhatikan. Kalau seandainya sudah sering dipakai, setiap hari dipakai, maka mungkin kita harus ganti setiap 6 sampai 9 bulan. Jangan lupa kontraindikasinya adalah pasien-pasien yang memiliki severe lower extremity atherosclerosis disease dengan AB 0,6. Jadi jangan lupa AB screening juga kita harus lakukan bukan hanya pasien-pasien PAD, pasien-pasien CVI yang membutuhkan compression. Jangan lupa untuk kita pastikan bahwa tidak memiliki severe lower extremity atherosclerosis disease ya. Kemudian juga pasien-pasien yang telah mengalami intervensi bypass di bawah misalnya, pasien-pasien sudah di bypass di daerah kaki ya jangan kita kompresi dengan compression stocking. Atau severe heart failure, kemudian juga ada yang alergi terhadap materialnya juga jangan diberikan ya. Yang ketiga, yang terakhir adalah pharmacological untuk conservative management ini. Ini merupakan venoactive drugs ya, tujuannya adalah untuk mengurangi simptom dan memperbaiki simptom. Secara umum dia mengurangi capillary permeabilities, kemudian inflammatory mediators dan juga mengurangi venous stones. Sebetulnya ini juga masih banyak perdebatan penggunaan obat-obat venoactive drugs ini, namun ya secara umum beberapa obat-obat tersebut mampu memperbaiki simptom. Tapi tentu saja ini hanya bersifat simptomatis sebetulnya karena jika kita tidak menghilangkan atau memperbaiki kondisi dari refluksnya itu sendiri, maka kondisinya akan terus terjadi. Nah, kapan sih kita harus memberikan pada pharmacological treatment ini pada pasien-pasien yang simptomatik? Tentu saja harus simptomatik terlebih dahulu, tidak menjalani interventional treatment, terus atau sedang menunggu interventional treatment, atau setelah di interventional treatment tetap masih ada persisting symptom atau edem. Ya ini adalah summary-nya. Jadi tadi yang populasi tadi itu masuk ke conservative treatment. Kapanpun kondisinya sebetulnya compression treatment itu menjadi kelas 1 ya, tetap. Sedangkan untuk exercise dan farmakoterapi itu di kelas 2A. Nah, selanjutnya adalah untuk intervensinya sendiri. Nah, kita sebagai kardiologis juga kita perlu tahu ya intervensinya seperti apa. Jadi kapan sih kita lakukan intervention pada superficial vein, ya, CVI? Sebetulnya semua stage dari mulai stage C2 ke atas dengan simptomatik, tentu saja harus simptomatik, itu merupakan pasien-pasien yang direkomendasikan untuk interventional treatment, ya, semuanya. Namun pada pasien-pasien dengan edem saja, jangan lupa juga kita harus mencari kemungkinan adanya other causes yang bisa mengakibatkan dia edema. Dan yang terakhir adalah ternyata superficial venous incompetence ini sendiri yang menjalani endovenous teknik baik pun dengan atau tanpa valvulektomi, sebaiknya prosedurnya dilakukan di outpatient setting. Jadi sebetulnya juga kita bisa bilang bisa one day service, bahkan sebetulnya seperti itu ya, dalam tanda kutip. Nah, intervention itu sendiri ada banyak, ada kurang lebih saya bagi menjadi 3. Ini diambil dari guideline 2002 SVS. Dibagi menjadi thermal ablation, non-thermal ablation, dan juga high ligation atau stripping atau pembedahan. Thermal ablation itu meliputi laser ablation, kemudian radio frekuensi ablation, ada juga steam ablation, ada juga microwave ablation. Sedangkan non-thermal yang paling sering kita dengar adalah cyanoacrylic closure device, kemudian ada ultrasound guided foam cell therapy, dan juga MOCA. Ini mungkin harus agak lebih cepat, saya sedikit mohon maaf. Untuk dari penelitian sendiri, meta-analisis di atas 5 tahun kita lihat bahwa EFLA, RFA, dan HLS memiliki efektivitas yang sama. Namun ultrasound guided foam therapy itu lebih sedikit efektif dibandingkan HLS maupun EFLA. Kemudian kalau kita lihat dari recurrent SFG refluxnya, sebetulnya lebih baik pada kelompok-kelompok yang menjalankan HLS, ya. Namun secara quality of life improve-nya itu sama di antara FLS dan HLS dan FLA. Tapi untuk melihat komplikasinya, ya, ternyata FLA itu lebih kecil komplikasinya, lebih sedikit juga operational time-nya, dan juga memiliki intraoperatif blood loss yang lebih rendah. Maka dari itu, dari guideline disebutkan bahwa endovascular endovascular thermal ablation merupakan first of choice treatment pada pasien-pasien superficial venous disease yang membutuhkan penanganan intervensi. Dan mana yang dipilih dari thermal ablation sendiri itu sebetulnya dikembalikan lagi kepada physician discretion, ya. Oke, ini sedikit aja kita kasih lihat perbedaan antara endovenous laser ablation dan radiofrequency ablation. Jadi pada intinya yang satu menggunakan laser sebagai energi untuk menimbulkan thermalnya, dan satu lagi adalah dengan menggunakan radiofrequency. Untuk venous laser ablation, dia dilakukan ablasi sambil di pull back, kemudian di delivery energi secara continuous. Sedangkan untuk yang radiofrequency ablasi, dia diberikan secara segmental. Jadi pada saat pull back tidak diberikan energi radiofrequensi, hanya pada saat secara segmental dilakukan ablasi. Kemudian setelah itu ada juga kita kenal dengan cyanoacrylate adhesive closure, ini juga cukup marak, ya, mulai meningkat penggunaannya. Secara penelitian memang non-inferiority, ya, hasil dari CAC ini atau cyanoacrylate adhesive closure ini dibandingkan dengan EFLA maupun RFA secara studi di 5 tahun extension study. Namun ada beberapa issues yang muncul. Yang pertama adalah hypersensitif terhadap cyanoacrylate yang ternyata 6-7%. Kalau ada sejawat yang mendengarkan atau mengikuti workshop Vena kemarin, ternyata salah satu guru kita juga di Harapan Kita pernah memberikan cyanoacrylate cyanoacrylate agen, dan ternyata memiliki atau terjadi shock anafilaktik. Dan juga isu yang kedua adalah masalah migrasi yang kemungkinan bisa terjadi, ya. Yang ketiga, yang selanjutnya adalah mechanochemical ablation atau MOCA. Nah, untuk MOCA ini sendiri ternyata hasil penelitiannya MOCA ini lebih kurang efektif dibandingkan RFA maupun EFLA, ya, dengan occlusion rate-nya 80% jika dibandingkan dengan RFA dan LFA kurang lebih 100%. Dan juga untuk perioperatif recanalization rate-nya ternyata dia sangat berhubungan dengan GSV diameter. Makin besar GSV diameternya, maka recanalization rate-nya juga akan meningkat. Ini adalah summary-nya. Jadi kalau kita bisa lihat di sini banyak yang bisa kita gunakan, namun ternyata yang sudah established lebih dari 5 tahun adalah thermal ablation, HLS, dan CIC, juga UGFS. Namun tentu saja untuk reflux ablution dan juga quality improve of life-nya, improvement-nya itu baik di thermal ablation, HLS, dan shunt acrylic closure device ya. Secara umum kita bisa lihat ini sama saja sebetulnya di GSV maupun SSV. Kita juga perlu lihat dulu yang pertama, paling penting pertama adalah kita menemukan dari simptomatik dulu. Dia harus simptomatik, kemudian kelas dari C2 ke atas. Kita lihat yang menjadi permasalahan utama adalah apakah dia GSV trunknya atau tributarisnya atau SSV tributarisnya. Jadi kita lihat dulu dari situ. Kemudian setelah itu pilihannya sama. Endovenous thermal ablation merupakan pilihan yang pertama dengan kelas 1A. Kemudian setelah itu disusul dengan HLS dan CAC pada grade 7 vein, sedangkan kelas untuk di SSV-nya itu dia kelas 2B. Oke, sebagai take home message, yang pertama adalah chronic venous insufficiency ini merupakan penyakit yang kronik dan progresif dan masih underdiagnosed dan untreated ya, bahkan di negara maju, apalagi di negara berkembang. Dan pasien-pasien dengan chronic venous disease, penggunaan CHIP classification dan VCSS scoring system ini sangat direkomendasikan untuk clinical audit dan research. Khususnya untuk VCSS juga kita bisa gunakan sebagai follow up ya, follow up treatment. Doppler ultrasound itu merupakan primary diagnostic test yang menjadi pilihan untuk pasien-pasien CVI yang dapat memberikan informasi kita mengenai venous anatomi, patensi, venopatologik dan juga alirannya. Manajemen CVI ya, terutama di superficial vein itu meliputi conservative treatment di mana di dalamnya adalah physical methods, compression and pharmacological yang tujuan untuk mengurangi atau menghilangkan gejala dan mencegah untuk progresivitas dari penyakit. Dan intervensi juga bisa dilakukan pada selected patient. Pasien-pasien yang menjalani superficial venous vein treatment, maka pilihan yang menjadi first choice treatment recommendation-nya adalah endovenous thermal ablation dengan pemilihan tipe thermal ablation-nya dikembalikan kepada diskresi dari dokternya, tentu saja dengan berdiskusi bersama pasien. Mungkin sekian presentasi dari saya. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ya, terima kasih kepada Dr. Hafiz yang untuk paparannya yang sangat jelas ya. Berikutnya kita lanjutkan dengan pembicara kedua, yaitu Dr. Muhammad Reza Junieri Pasioli yang akan membawakan tentang updated management from medical treatment to lower extremity revascularization, recent, past, and future direction. Kami tampilkan kurikulum vitae dari Dr. Reza, silakan. Ya. Dr. Reza saat ini bertugas di Rumah Sakit Al Ihsan. Dia adalah lulusan dari Departemen Kardiologi dan Kedokteran Vaskuler Universitas Pajajaran RS Hasan Sadikin Bandung. Sekarang bekerja sebagai Kepala Laboratorium Kateterisasi di RSUD Al Ihsan. Kami persilahkan Dr. Reza untuk mempresentasikan makalahnya. Silakan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya bisa share screen? Ya, saya bisa share screen. Oke. Kelihatan sudah share screen?
Ya, sudah, Dr. Reza.
Ya.
Silakan.
Ya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi. Untuk mempersingkat waktunya, saya akan presentasikan tentang manajemen PAD for medical treatment to lower extremity revascularization. Kita tahu bahwa PAD penyebabnya adalah hal utamanya adalah atherosclerosis plaque, di mana terjadinya penurunan dari aliran pembuluh darah ke ekstremitas sehingga terjadinya lumen diameter dari arterinya menurun. Hal ini bersifat suatu progresif, di mana mulai dari endotel yang baik sampai terjadinya suatu progresif plaque, akhirnya suatu trombosis. Hal ini terjadi di mana semua pembuluh darah. Kita tahu bahwa major vascular manifestasi atherosclerosis baik di kepala, di otak, di koroner, di kaki, di ginjal, semuanya terjadi di semua tempat. Namun pada PAD seringkali kita underdiagnose dan under treatment. Mortalitas selama 10 tahun pada pasien PAD kita lihat bahwa pada penderita normal dan severe PAD bahwa mortalitas jauh sangat signifikan menurun pada pasien yang severe PAD selama 10 tahun. Dan bagaimana kita men-screening dari PAD? Satu, dengan pasien usia kurang 50 tahun dengan diabetes ditambah dengan faktor resiko, modifikasi seperti smoker, dislipidemi, hipertensi, usia 50-69 tahun dengan riwayat merokok atau diabetes, usia 70 tahun dengan atau lebih, atau diketahui CAD, carotid, dan renal disease, atau diketahui juga dengan riwayat claudication atau luka yang tidak sembuh. Ini faktor risiko PAD yang paling banyak adalah usia, berikut diikuti dengan laki-laki, BMI, dan family history. Spektrum dari PAD itu sangat luas, mulai dari normal, claudication, sampai limb threatening. Dan perlu diingat juga dia adalah worsening flow limitation. Bila dibiarkan saja akan progresif penyakit tersebut. Dan spektrum klinis di PAD paling banyak adalah asimptomatik 50%, yang critical ischemia itu hanya 2%, yang klasik ada 15%, yang atipikal ada 33%. Seringkali kita ketahui fenomena iceberg seperti ini ya, simptomatik, sedangkan yang asimptomatik adalah sangat banyak sekali. 90% diagnosis PAD adalah missing kita, dan asimptomatik dengan abnormal ABI 50% akan meningkatkan resiko komplikasi kardiovaskular. Bagaimana simptomnya? Simptomnya mulai dari abnormal dari kulit, perubahan warna kulit, kehitaman atau mencang, dingin, coldness, claudication, chest pain, dan keluhan yang lain ini namun jarang, seperti peripheral neuropathy, erectile dysfunction, jarang. Ini tadi yang saya sebutkan, spektrumnya sangat paling banyak adalah asimptomatik. Apa yang disebut typical symptom dan atypical symptom? Kalau typical symptom adalah bila penderita jalan kaki dalam beberapa meter sudah nyeri, dan bila dengan istirahat dan hilang selama 10 menit, maka kita dapat disebutkan intermittent claudication. Populasinya sekitar 33%. Sedangkan yang atypical symptom, exertional leg pain, dan dia saat exertional dia nyerinya masih bisa mereka tahan dan tidak ada hubungannya dengan resolve dari selama 10 menit. Ini populasinya sangat banyak, lebih dari 50%. Ini klasifikasi PAD dari stage 0 sampai stage 6, kita bagikan dari Rutherford and Fontaine. Dan yang paling bahaya adalah yang meningkatkan resiko amputasi dan kematian adalah stage 4 sampai 6. Ini ada klasifikasi PAD untuk akut limb ischemia berdasarkan Rutherford, mulai dari 1, 2A, 2B, 3 berdasarkan sensorik, motorik, dan Doppler. Dopplernya juga kita lihat dari arteri dan vein. Ini klasifikasi PAD kronik. Kita dapat menggunakan dua klasifikasi, apakah Fontaine atau Rutherford. Ini. Dan bagaimana gambaran dari PAD? Umumnya adalah kalau tidak ada rambut atau kukunya lepas, dry, skinny, pallor, kadang-kadang ada luka yang tidak sembuh, ada iskemik, ini baru kita ini. Dan yang meningkatkan mortalitas dari PAD adalah acute limb ischemia, di mana ada penurunan perfusi pada ekstremitas limb yang menyebabkan mengancam dari viability limb. Di mana bila dibiarkan dalam waktu by waktu, detik ke detik, detik ke jam, jam ke hari, dia akan menyebabkan cell dysfunction, progressive ischemic, bahkan kematian pada sel. Akhirnya jaringan tersebut akan menjadi rusak. di mana terjadi proses lean-nya berubah dari aerobik ke anaerobik. Ini yang normalnya, ini yang rusaknya. Ini klasifikasi lean kita yang akut dibagi yang murni akut kurang dari 14 hari atau akut on chronic yang gimana mulai dari sebelumnya sudah ada fase kronik dan kemudian menjadi akut, sedangkan yang kronik adalah yang lebih dari 14 hari. Patofisiologi kita bagi dari akut embolic ischemia, di mana umumnya paling sering kita ada atrial fibrillation, thrombus, di mana umumnya emboli yang menutup dari atrial tree, umumnya terjadi pada aortic bifurcation, iliaca, femoral, popliteal. Ini yang akut embolic ischemia. Sedangkan yang akut thrombotic ischemic, di mana ada suatu proses aterosklerosis, penyempitan di atrial tree, akhirnya menstimulasi adanya kolateral, dan akhirnya terjadi suatu iskemi. Bila tertutup, akhirnya penderita tersebut akan menjadi iskemi. Tanda-tanda yang harus diperhatikan pada ahli adalah 5B, di mana keluhannya nyeri, dingin, seperti ini. Nah, kita lihat ada perubahan warna kulit, pucat, akhirnya cyanosis, akhirnya mereka menjadi fixed mottling, cyanosis. Ini ada reversible, nah, akhirnya jadi area cyanosis. Kemudian ini di daerah mottling di sini dia ada udah fix di mana udah keunguan. Bila sudah mencapai area ini maka fungsi vena sudah mencapai iskemik. Palpasi di mana kita penting untuk menaba pulsasi arteri baik femoral, poplitea, posterior, dorsalis pedis. Di mana pada akut iskemi terjadinya penurunan bahkan tidak ada pulsasi. Temperatur kita dingin juga sangat dingin, ada kontras perubahan. Capillary refill juga berubah. Parestesi mulai dari rangsang yang ringan sampai vibrasi sampai deep pain dan pressure pain. Yang paralisis tidak bisa digerakkan akhirnya mengancam irreversible. Jadi muscular rigidity-nya akan iskemi. Dan juga kita ketahui ada 6P ya, poikilothermia. Ultrasound adalah diagnosis kita diagnosis untuk menegakkan diagnosis yang murah, cepat, dan tidak menggunakan kontras dan tempat yang dimanapun kita menggunakan Doppler, akhirnya kita dapat menegakkan diagnosis. Untuk ABI tidak disarankan pada akut iskemia. Bagaimana similaritas dari CAD di sini adalah satu poin yang penting. Kita lihat CAD itu kita sering kali dengan EKG. PAD adalah kita dengan ankle brachial index. Kita echo CAD, pada PAD kita nilai segmental pressure, PVR-nya plus volume risk. Dan kalau pada CAD kita stress test, pada PAD kita treadmill test, kita lihat working-nya bagaimana. Sedangkan CAD kita angiografi, kita di sini bisa invasive angiografi, MRA, CT angio. Ini appropriateness dari peripheral intervention di mana hampir semuanya pada aortoiliac, SVA, below-the-knee, semua rekomendasi kelas A. Pada below-the-knee, di mana balon angioplasti adalah appropriateness untuk dilakukan intervensi. Ini modalitas dari pemeriksaan PAD adalah dengan non-invasive teknik, exercise test, segmental pressure, segmental volume plethysmography, dan pada ini invasive teknik. Ini adalah modalitas yang akan kita gunakan. Ini adalah tool ankle brachial index yang dimana dapat menilai dia sangat mudah, murah, dan dapat dilakukan di PPK 1 kita nilai di mana nilai ankle tekanan darah pada lengan kanan, lengan kiri, tungkai kanan, bawah kanan dan kiri. Di mana untuk lengan kanan kita nilai dengan high right ankle pressure dibagi high arm pressure, dengan yang kiri high left ankle pressure dengan high arm pressure. Nanti di sini akan kita lihat nilai AB. Bila AB-nya kurang 0,9, kita konfirmasi dengan PAD, akhirnya kita lakukan diagnosis. Kalau lebih dari 1,4, kita nilai pressure segmental, PVR, dan radial test. Berdasarkan saya ambil dari ESC bahwa duplex ultrasound, CTA, MRI, lalu extremitas ini ada rekomendasi kelas 1. Sedangkan invasif angiografi kelas 1 bila penderita itu CLI dan harus dilakukan revaskularisasi. Ini gambaran dari imaging sebelum dilakukan kita revaskularisasi atau treatment strategi apa yang kita lakukan, kita harus imaging dahulu. Ini ada CT angio, ini MRA. Dan bagaimana terapi PAD? Ini adalah sangat multidisiplin sekali. Satu yang penting adalah kontrol faktor risiko, struktur exercise program, edukasi keluhan progresif dari keluhan, simptom, and sign, dan medical terapi, dan juga kolaborasi dengan kayak perawat luka, itu sangat penting sekali. Kemudian dari beberapa hal ini, kemudian kita dapat merekomendasi apakah perlu nggak invasive treatment, endovascular intervention, atau bedah. Tujuan dari terapi PAD adalah meningkatkan status fungsional, preserve limb, mencegah dari progressive atherosclerosis, menurunkan cardiac and cerebrovascular morbidity and mortalitas, meningkatkan keluhan dari kualitas hidup, dan meningkatkan exercise, dan menurunkan kebutuhan dari revaskularisasi, dan menurunkan non-fatal seperti myocardial infarct dan stroke. Ini adalah prinsip dari PAD, di mana modifikasi faktor risiko dan beri antiplatelet. Di mana penderita itu bila ada merokok, kita berhenti, target lipid kurang dari 70, tekanan darah, gula darah. Beberapa dari ESC menyarankan aspirin dan clopidogrel, namun di AHA dan SKY menyarankan cilostaxol. Ini terapi berdasarkan dari simptom. Kalau intermittent claudication, kita dapat exercise terapi, obat-obat, dan revaskularisasi bila severe disability, di mana tujuannya adalah merilis dari keluhannya. Sedangkan pada critical ischemic, seperti adanya luka, kita wound care, memberi antibiotik, revaskularisasi apa endo atau surgery, kemudian kita tujuannya adalah menyelamatkan limbnya. Ini adalah intinya sama dari asymptomatic, mild, and moderate, and under CLI, di mana terapinya adalah menurunkan progresif dari PAD dan cardiovascular risk. Dan tujuannya ada akhir, yaitu limb salvage. Ini adalah kenapa harus diberi antiplatelet, di mana pada antiplatelet akan menurunkan dari terjadinya prevention ischemic dari peripheral artery disease. Ini gimana thrombotik pada intermittent claudication atau yang post bypass atau post angioplasti, di mana dia dengan pemberian anti trombotik akan menurunkan terjadinya ischemic event. Ini ada data terbaru dari APSC, peripheral artery disease. Kita bahwa semua terapi dapat digunakan. Satu, seperti saya jelaskan, adalah modifikasi faktor risiko, baik hipertensi, lipid, merokok, pola hidup, dan diabetes. Ini sama hal seperti coronary artery disease. Sedangkan penggunaan antikoagulan ini tapi benefitnya masih besar dibandingkan risiko. Namun ini trial masih sedikit, 2B. Kita dapat menggunakan combine aspirin dengan rivaroxaban. Dan cilostaxol pada Asia Pacific Guideline, di mana menunjukkan bahwa meningkatkan keluhan dan meningkatkan walking distance kelas 1 ya di sini. Kenapa cilostaxol? Sebagai aktivasi antiplatelet, antitrombotik, vasodilator, sedikit meningkatkan heart rate, meningkatkan blood flow perifer, meningkatkan HDL, menurunkan trigliserida, dan sebagai inhibisi dari vascular smooth muscle cell. Efek cilostaxol juga meningkatkan walking distance, di mana ini perbedaan sangat jauh berbeda dengan pemberian silostazol, dia akan pain-free walking distance. Sedangkan dibandingkan yang semakin meningkatkan dosis, maka dia pada dosis 200 mg per hari, maka keuntungan dari free walking pain distance ini lebih tinggi. Sedangkan yang bila terjadinya setelah memberi anti silostazol berhenti, kemudian akan terjadi suatu withdrawal, ini yang sangat bahaya, makanya pemberian silostazol harus continue. Dan bagaimana efek atorvastatin pada maksimum walking time, di mana terjadinya perbedaan maksimum walking time-nya jauh lebih baik dibandingkan yang placebo. Ini pain-free walking time juga sama. Nah, exercise, kapan kamu exercise? Exercise disarankan pasien latihan dengan exercise terus bila nyeri berhenti. Di sini menyebutkan bahwa exercise sangat berperan penting dalam untuk terapi dari PAD. Bagaimana kita memberi prescription untuk PAD? Mungkin dari satu exercise lebih dari 30 menit, frekuensinya lebih dari 3 kali dalam seminggu, program latihannya lebih dari 26 minggu, dan train endpoint-nya mendekati maksimal pain. Mode exercise-nya adalah berjalan. Ini AHA guideline menyebutkan juga merekomendasi kelas 1, silostazol juga kelas 1. Dan yang paling penting dari PAD adalah kapan kita revaskularisasi. Sebelum revaskularisasi kita harus tahu indikasi. Indikasi ada pasien untuk limb saving pada critical limb ischemic, dan namun beberapa dari ESC atau perhimpunan dari negara lain, intermittent claudication masih kontroversial untuk meningkatkan outflow. Intervention target ada improve inflow, restore line blood flow, restore food circle, and direct blood flow in the wound area. Di mana kita tahu dari Basel trial bypass dengan angioplasti adalah sama, non-significant difference. Kita lihat gambar, mana yang kita pilih, apakah dengan bypass seperti ini atau endovaskular. Hal ini dari Basel trial bahwa menunjukkan hal yang sama. Nah, ini ada slide yang penting dari saya. Kapan kita lakukan intervensi? Yang dilakukan intervensi pada pasien yang claudication kita analogikan seperti anginan. Urgensi untuk revaskularisasi whenever. Sedangkan pasien critical ischemic seperti hilang iskeminya, respen, refractory infection, seperti ACS, kapanpun kita lakukan intervensi. Ini adalah bagian yang paling sering adalah bagian di daerah SFA. Ini klasifikasi TAS, di mana potensinya antara bypass dengan intervensi adalah tidak jauh berbeda, 65-80% untuk autoiliac disease. Oke, saya lanjut, Dok. Ini mungkin
waktunya tinggal 1 menit lagi, Dr. Reza.
Ya, SKY dan ESC guideline juga menyebutkan kita untuk peripheral intervention. Ini Basel trial, di mana exercise. AHA guideline juga, ini kita langsung ke case. Ini adalah kita lakukan intervensi, setelah dilakukan angioplasti ada perbaikan. Ya. Ini sebelumnya seperti ini, sesudahnya seperti ini, jauh lebih baik ke bawah. Ini before, ini after, dan ini ada pasien yang kedua, ini ada stenosis di daerah sini, kemudian kita lakukan intervensi, ini selesai. Ya, yang nggak ada flow, akhirnya ada flow. Oke, ini ada pasien dengan akut limb ischemic post COVID-19 2 minggu, tidak ada pulsasi di ekstremitas kiri, gambarnya seperti ini. Ya, kemudian kita tidak ada ini, ya, flow. Saya lakukan kombinasi PTA dan CDT. CDT after 36, alirannya jauh lebih bagus, ini nggak jalan. Ini kita flow, perbaikan, dari awalnya monofasik ke bifasik, follow up CDT after 2 minggu seperti ini, pasien bisa di jalan. Kita lakukan dengan pemberian silostazol, rivaroxaban. Oke, PAD suatu seringkali kita underdiagnosis, under treatment, dan seringkali meningkatkan risiko kardiovaskular event. Penilai diagnosis seperti riwayat penyakit, pemeriksaan fisik, status tes fungsional, dan vascular imaging adalah sangat penting untuk menegakkan PAD. Agresif faktor modifikasi faktor risiko pada critical dan cardiovascular event sangat penting. Treatment dari seperti exercise therapy, drug therapy, pemilihan revaskularisasi ada yang sangat penting. Banyak studi yang menyebutkan keuntungan dari silostazol pada PAD untuk menurunkan iskemik dan memperbaiki keluhan dan meningkatkan distance walking-nya. Bagaimana revaskulasi PAD? Kita berdasarkan TAS, SKY maupun ESC bahwa endovaskular adalah yang pertama sebelum dilakukan bypass. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dok? Udah, Dok?
Baik, terima kasih Dr. Reza untuk presentasinya yang komprehensif ya. Baiklah, kita lanjutkan dengan sesi diskusi. Sudah terdapat beberapa pertanyaan dalam kolom chat. Ini mungkin pertanyaan untuk Dr. Reza ya. Pada pasien dengan ALI, apakah kita perlu melakukan pengukuran ABI? Kemudian mungkin saya perluas sedikit, kalau pada CLTI bagaimana kita melakukannya? Silakan Dr. Reza.
Kalau pada ALI kita tidak boleh, Dok ya. Kalau pada CLTI kita bila pada CLTI boleh ada algoritmanya, Dok. Kalau misalnya dia dengan luka otomatis tidak boleh ya. Kalau pada yang intermittent yang masih rest pain, tidak terlalu nyeri, itu boleh juga CLTI. Kalau ALI tidak boleh, Dok, untuk penggunaan ABI.
Iya, jadi tidak bisa dilakukan pada kondisi ALI ya, karena itu akan mempererat iskemik. Saya lanjutkan saja dengan pertanyaan berikutnya, Dr. Reza. Ini juga untuk Dr. Reza. Bagaimana pendekatan tata laksana CLI dan ALI jika sumbatannya setinggi level arteri poplitea? Silakan Dr. Reza.
Kalau kalau misalnya dia penderita dengan PAD setinggi arteria poplitea, kita lihat satu berdasarkan dia urgensinya. Kalau urgensinya dia critical limb ischemic, kalau dia flow-nya adanya luka, itu tuh kita urgensinya harus dilakukan revas. Kalau dia AB-nya kurang dari 0,6, flow-nya sampai ke di daerah proksimal sampai distalnya adanya suatu terhambat, kita harus buka. Intinya itu sih, Dok. Kalau di bawah infrapoplitea dia adanya suatu intermittent claudication, umumnya kita bisa konservatif. Jadi satu, intinya berdasarkan dari klinis. Kedua, berdasarkan dari imaging. Ketiga mungkin kita kalau buka kita ada risk and benefit-nya gimana? Itunya sih, Dok.
Iya, terima kasih. Saya kira sudah cukup jelas, Dr. Reza. Ini mungkin ada beberapa pertanyaan tentang obat-obatan. Saya gabung saja sekaligus. Pertama itu tentang penggunaan triple terapi pada pasien-pasien dengan CLI, apakah diperlukan? Kemudian apakah ada kontraindikasi penggunaan beta blocker pada pasien-pasien dengan CLI? Dan bagaimana tentang safety dari penggunaan beta blocker pada PAD? Barangkali ini bisa sekaligus dijawab oleh Dr. Reza.
Iya, kalau penggunaan antiplatelet pada pasien antiplatelet pada PAD dan CAD bagaimana? Kita kalau keuntungan pemberian antiplatelet, cilostazol itu selain sebagai antiplatelet ada sebagai vasodilator, meningkatkan walking distance, menurunkan iskemik, sebagai antipleuropiknya juga ada. Itu keunggulan dari cilostazol dibandingkan aspirin. Kalau penggunaan pasien dengan konkomitan antara PAD dan CAD, mungkin pemberiannya hanya cilostazol saja, dok. Kalau triple antiplatelet disarankan sih kalau penderita dengan akan meningkatkan resiko bleeding. Kalau dengan semakin meningkatkan resiko bleeding ya saran sih saya jangan triple antiplatelet. Kita lihat dulu dari ini case by case. Satu, kalau pasien dengan intermittent claudication kita berikan dengan single antiplatelet. Antiplateletnya apa saja yang tadi bisa aspirin, clopidogrel, atau cilostazol. Namun mengingat cilostazol mempunyai kelebihannya yang tadi saya bilangkan, telah saya sampaikan sebagai vasodilator, antipleuropik, meningkatkan exercise itu dan meningkatkan walking distance itu adalah cilostazol. Di mana juga AHA guideline lebih menyarankan AHA dan SKY dan Asia Pasifik perkumpulan itu menyarankan cilostazol kecuali ESC.
Ya. Nah. Ya, terima kasih Dr. Reza. Ini mungkin ada pertanyaan untuk Dr. Hafiz ya mengenai intervensi pada deep vein insufficiency. Jadi apakah kita tahu bahwa kemajuan pada intervensi peripheral vascular itu meningkat banyak ya, terutama pada venous ya. Tapi pada deep vein itu apakah intervensinya banyak manfaatnya tidak atau bagaimana perkembangannya?
Oke, terima kasih Dr. Syarif pertanyaannya. Jadi betul seperti yang Dr. Syarif sampaikan bahwa perkembangan intervensional di peripheral itu saat ini makin berkembang. Khususnya di vein, mungkin untuk yang subvenous vein itu banyak intervensi yang metode yang bisa dilakukan. Namun untuk di vein sendiri dok, ternyata berdasarkan beberapa penelitian ini masih belum ada salah satu tindakan yang memang dianggap cukup safety dan prolong untuk outcome ke depannya baik itu masih belum jelas dok sebetulnya. Tapi untuk utamanya untuk terapi di vein itu sendiri sama seperti superficial vein sebetulnya yang menjadi cornerstone dari terapi di vein insufficiency adalah compression stocking. Ketika compression stocking tidak bisa memberikan hasil yang baik, maka kita perlu lihat case by case juga. Dalam guideline SWS 2022 memang ada beberapa kasus-kasus seperti post thrombotic syndrome yang bisa juga mengakibatkan gangguan di vena dalamnya. Maka dari itu mungkin kita akan sesuaikan juga seperti apakah dibutuhkan rekanalisasi pada kasus-kasus yang post DVT, misalnya dia masih ada dengan obstruction. Seperti kita ketahui bahwa CVI tidak hanya reflux disease, bisa juga dengan obstruction. Maka bisa kita lakukan rekanalisasi atau stenting. Namun tentu saja untuk di vein ini sendiri beberapa case juga ada yang melakukan dengan valvuloplasty. Namun ternyata safety dan long term outcome-nya juga masih belum jelas, dok. Mungkin itu, dok. Terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih Dr. Hafiz. Sebetulnya masih ada beberapa pertanyaan lagi, tapi karena waktunya sudah habis, mungkin saya simpulkan saja bahwa intervensi dalam bidang vaskular itu telah berkembang sangat pesat, ya. Walaupun penyebaran dari diseminasi dari keahliannya itu masih terbatas. Jadi ini bidang yang berkembang pesat, tapi dengan keterbatasan dalam beberapa hal. Mungkin sekian saja simposium 8 ini kita tutup. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih kepada kedua pembicara yang telah mempresentasikan hasilnya dengan sangat baik. Sekian, terima kasih.
Selanjutnya, kita akan kedatangan pembicara internasional yang sangat menarik dalam sesi Bandung Meet Heart Failure Expert, Setting an Advanced Heart Failure Management Program ab initio. Kami menghadirkan Prof. Simkem Leng David, Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery, Master of Medicine in Internal Medicine, membership of the Royal College of Physicians of the United Kingdom, dari National Heart Center of Singapore. Sesi ini akan dimoderatori oleh Dr. Hawani Sasmaya Prameswari, spesialis jantung pembuluh darah konsultan, dan didukung oleh dua panelis, Dr. Dian Yaniarti, spesialis jantung pembuluh darah konsultan, dan Dr. Erwinanto, spesialis jantung pembuluh darah konsultan.
Berikut kami tampilkan CV dari moderator pada sesi ini dengan Dr. Hawani Sasmaya Prameswari, spesialis jantung pembuluh darah konsultan. Beliau lulus sebagai spesialis jantung dan pembuluh darah pada tahun 2017 di Fakultas Kedokteran Universitas Padjadjaran dan telah menyelesaikan Fellow Advanced Heart Failure di National Heart Center Singapore pada tahun 2020 dan saat ini beliau menjadi staf Departemen Kardiologi dan Kedokteran Vaskular Fakultas Kedokteran Universitas Padjadjaran. Beliau merupakan member dari Heart Failure Society dan member dari Indonesian Heart Failure Cardiometabolic PERCI. Okay, hi everyone, good morning. Thank you for staying with us until these sessions. And I'm Hawani Sasmaya. We are back again to the new sessions in BCU. We call it as a Bandung Meet Heart Failure Expert. And it's an honor for me to again chairing these new sessions in BCU this year. And today, another heart failure expert has joined us. And it's a distinct pleasure and honor for me to introduce my teacher, my one and only heart failure mentor, and also my one and only boss, Professor David Sim, who is an expert in heart failure, and may I say also one of the huge persons and also most influential persons in heart failure, especially in Asian region. I think everyone has known him very well. He is a director in heart failure program at National Heart Center. He is also a senior consultant in National Heart Center Singapore, and also the president in Heart Failure Singapore Society. He is an expert in heart failure, of course, and also expert in advanced heart failure field, including ventricular assist device and heart transplant. Hi, boss. Prof. Sim, how are you?
Hey, morning.
Morning, boss. Okay. Thank you for your time and thank you for joining us today. And also two panelists that join us today. The first one is Dr. Erwinanto. He is a senior consultant in cardiology department, Faculty of Medicine, Padjadjaran University. Also my dearest teacher, Dr. Erwinanto. And then the second panelist is my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Dian Yaniarti. She is a staff in cardiology department at Harapan Kita National Heart Center Hospital. And she also has a deep interest in heart failure. Okay, without further ado, I would like to invite Prof. Sim to give his lecture, which entitled Setting an Advanced Heart Failure Management, Advanced Heart Failure Management Program at Inicio. Prof. Sim, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you. All right, can you see my slide?
Yes, I can see it clearly.
All right, thank you very much. So in the next half an hour, I've been invited and tasked to give this talk on setting up an advanced heart failure program. So I share with you what we have done in Singapore, which we started this advanced heart failure program more than 15 years ago. These are my declaration of interest. So the reason why we're interested in heart failure, why we're spending a Sunday morning to talk about heart failure is because we know that heart failure poses a very significant impact on the patient, and not only that, on the healthcare system as well. Globally, more than 60 million people has been diagnosed with heart failure, and the number is actually underrepresented and probably much higher. And not only that, Heart failure, we know, poses a very big burden on the hospitalization. A lot of patients above 65 years old, the number one cause for admission is actually heart failure. And not only that, those patients with depressed ejection fraction is HFrEF. 50% of them died within 5 years of diagnosis of heart failure. And look at the expenditure of globally in terms of the money that put into treating heart failure because of recurrent admission. More than 100 billion USD has been spent on heart failure. And to make things worse, we do know that heart failure is not something that is like, acute appendicitis or infection, where of course antibiotic or a minor surgical procedure will cure the patient. In heart failure, recurrent, event is the key to their disease. A lot of them will have worsening heart failure episode, most likely, over the years of treating them, you will see many episodes of decompensation that they come to the hospital. And to make things worse, every single episode of worsening heart failure is associated with a gradual deterioration in the kidney and the heart function. So it set up this vicious cycle for them. And despite the fact that, when you talk about heart failure, if you compare with, for example, renal failure, we are much more lucky in heart failure. We do have much more therapy, much more breakthrough. So from the 1980s, from the use of ACE inhibitor, to the 1990s, the use of beta blocker, and more recent year, the use of drugs like MRA and ARNI, and now we know that we're SGLT2 inhibitor as well. Unfortunately, the mortality still remains very high. That is why we still need to pay a lot of attention. Despite the 4 to 5 classes of drug we have for heart failure, it is still not a disease to be treated lightly. And we do know that heart failure is something that is comparable with those patients with cancer. Class 4 heart failure, and actually class 4 heart failure patient, their mortality is equally as bad as lung cancer and pancreatic cancer, two of the most feared cancer with the highest mortality. And the reason why we need to have a formal heart failure program, why we need to treat patients aggressively right from the start, is because if we don't start early and use drugs early, and make sure they have all the lifestyle modification, by the time the patient progress very advanced heart failure, they will probably need some form of device therapy. It could be an ICD, a CRT, or for some patient, for example, in Singapore, we do offer them left ventricular assist device or some form of artificial heart pump. The problem is device therapy is not so accessible to most patients in Asia. This is quite costly and also not acceptable to a lot of patients in Asia. From our experience in Singapore, we find that when compared to patients in US or Australia or Europe, the patient in Asia somehow just don't like the idea of having a foreign body implanted into them. So that's why it's very important to prevent the advancement of the heart failure to a very advanced stage as much earlier in the disease course. And the reason why a heart failure program is important is because we know that after discharge from the hospital for acute decompensation of heart failure, about a quarter of patients may be readmitted within 30 days. And the mortality during these first 30 days, what we call a very vulnerable phase, is up to 10%. That's why you need a good inpatient heart failure program to tackle this high readmission rate and this high mortality. Because by the time, if you were to see the patient a few weeks after discharge, they may have got readmitted, or worse still, up to 10% of them may actually pass away. And we also have data, this is taken from ESC long-term registry, to show that the best time to optimize the medical therapy for the patient is actually during their hospital admission, because this is a time where you can monitor their renal panel, their electrolyte imbalances, at the same time their blood pressure as well. It's the safest time to start a new drug. You can monitor them for 1 to 2 days before discharging them. And also at this point of time during admission, it is most likely the patient is going to take up your suggestion of a new drug because they have just recovered or they are still in heart failure, looking at their swollen leg, swollen tummy, or still having a bit of shortness of breath. It is easy to convince them compared to a few months down the road in the clinic where the patient may have forgotten the initial symptom. It's harder to convince them to take new medication. And heart failure program is not just about a heart failure clinic. a lot of people always assume having a heart failure clinic is equal to having a heart failure program. It comprises of the whole journey of the patient, right from the start, the inpatient care, all the way to the outpatient care. So you can see this taken from AHA from many years ago, the old guideline showing that optimization of the therapy before discharge is considered a class 1 indication. And unfortunately for ASEAN and Asia, a lot of data from heart failure actually come from, you can see, mainly from North America and from Europe. We have hardly any data to show us what is actually happening here in Asia. How are we doing compared to our Western neighbor? But fortunately for us, I think the last 5 to 7 years, the SHOP registry and the Asian Heart Failure Registry here in the Asia Pacific region have given us some insight of how are we doing compared to the rest of the world here in Asia. So this is the Asian Heart Failure Registry, which Indonesia took part as well. So you can see it is up to about 10 different regions here in Asia taking part in this multi-nation global registry in Asia, looking at the treatment of heart failure and how we are faring for heart failure. First, when we compare ourselves with the Western world, taking the Heart Failure Action Registry from the United States, and you can see here, one look, you can see that the patient with the from the US, the white patient, if you take that reference point, generally, whether you're Chinese or we're Malays from Indonesia or from Malaysia, or you're Indian from India subcontinent, or Japanese or Korean, on the whole, our comorbidities are much higher here in Asia among our heart failure patients compared to the white patient. This is taking the diabetes as an example. And then even within Asia itself, we do see difference among the different parts of Asia. Unfortunately for Singapore, where I come from, and for you staying in Indonesia, we are part of Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, when you look at the prevalence of coronary artery disease, hypertension or diabetes among our patients with heart failure, we have the highest prevalence compared to other parts of Asia. And this higher prevalence of comorbidities, unfortunately, is not just a bystander. It is actually something significant. As you can see here, not only are our patients, they have higher comorbidities, in terms of mortality at 1 year, regardless of whether the patient is have REF, that is ejection fraction less than 40%, or those patients with ejection fraction more than 40%, the HFpEF patient, you can see that again, this very worrying trend in Southeast Asia. Our 1 year mortality rate is much higher than the rest of Asia. So to tackle this high burden of heart failure, especially here, we know in Southeast Asia where outcomes not so good, what can we do? So one way is to have comprehensive heart failure disease management program. The aim is not just only to improve survival, but also importantly, heart failure patients, as we know, a lot of them have a lot of symptoms. So in terms of symptom relief, in terms of functional status, quality of life, that are all very important parameters that we need to improve in the heart failure program as well. Of course, we want to improve patient compliance as well. And to the hospital level or to the government and the ministry level, they want to see with such a program, we can decrease overall medical costs by preventing readmission for the patient. So this is a diagram showing you, picture showing you how in Singapore we have progressed. So we started on, I would say 20 years ago, actually 2002, the first heart failure program in Singapore was launched, and it started off with heart failure clinic, and eventually we moved it into the inpatient, and then we incorporated our LVAD program and our transplant program into our heart failure program as well. So again, I emphasize to you the heart failure program is not just a heart failure clinic. As you can see here, right at the top of the picture, the heart failure clinic is just part of the heart failure program. A proper heart failure program should comprise of an inpatient program. Education is a big part of a heart failure program. And of course, eventually, as the program grows, you want to incorporate things like palliative care into the program as well. And your surgical colleague who do a heart transplant and LVAD, they probably should be part of this heart failure program as well. Because at the end of the day, it is the heart failure program that will refer the patient to the surgeon for heart transplant and LVAD. And of course, importantly, you need to have a clinical research, clinical trial component eventually to further the, bring the heart failure program to the next level. And in the heart failure program, the main person in this multi-professional team in a very coordinated way is actually, unfortunately, not me or not Hawani, the heart failure cardiologist. The key person to make this whole thing work is actually the heart failure nurse. They are the main coordinator who will link all the different members together. So no one member is more important to the others. Everybody have a role to play. So it's not just about cardiologists. You need to have the heart failure nurses, the physiotherapists, the pharmacists, the dietitian, and of course, importantly, the surgeon eventually should part this program because of the need for surgical therapy for some of these heart failure patients with advanced heart failure. And this is just a snapshot of what a heart failure nursing service should look like. So nursing is not just about attending to patient in an inpatient or outpatient service. They have to do things such as telephone follow-up or what we call tele-monitoring or telemedicine in Singapore. And not only that, the heart failure nurses also are a very important source of people to the providing of heart failure education to not just a patient, but to their family and the caregiver as well. And the heart failure nurses are also a very important person for training of our staff and resource person. So our multidisciplinary heart failure team, where the dietitian and the physiotherapists and of course the pharmacists, when they get involved, they need to know exactly what a heart failure patient needs, and the heart failure nursing will be a good source of so-called knowledge gap for this group of allied health to train them up so that they can cater to the needs of a heart failure patient. So does a heart failure nurse work? Does it even work in this part of the world in Asia? Many years ago, in 2006, we did this abstract and presented overseas to look at a comparison on the readmission rate with and without heart failure nurse. So we found out that with a heart failure nurse, we were able to reduce our readmission rate per year by, you can see, 50%. So the readmission rate was reduced by half if we have a heart failure nurse. In those periods where we don't have a heart failure nurse, the readmission rate was twice of that with compared with the period where we have a nurse. And what our heart failure nurses do is, in Singapore, what I do in National Heart Center is I don't believe in waiting for referral, because the problem with waiting for referral of an advanced heart failure patient or a heart failure patient to you is, by the time they're referred to you, unfortunately, we always realize in our early setup of the heart failure program, refer too late. What do you mean by refer too late? That is, by the time they come to us, they may have liver cirrhosis from severe right heart failure. They may have already, very advanced kidney impairment, almost needing dialysis. That group of patients with multi-organ failure, unfortunately, we can't do much to help them. So we want to catch the heart failure patient early, ideally even when they're first diagnosed heart failure, to make sure that they are given the appropriate guideline-directed medical therapy, retard the progress of the disease to very advanced stage. So what we do is we do an active screening. So on a daily basis, the heart failure nurse with this screening sheet, they will go and look for patients. Anyone admitted with a diagnosis of heart failure will be recruited into the heart failure program. So this is what happened. The heart failure nurse will identify the patient before the ward round start in the morning, and then the heart failure team led by the heart failure cardiologist will then review the patient. And after that, a whole series of things will happen, which include education by the heart failure nurse to the patient and family. And eventually you can see that we will have a telephone follow-up within 2 weeks of discharge to make sure the patient is okay. Showing you this, this is an old ESC guideline 2016, just to show you that guidelines are moving very fast. Now we'll move on to a new guideline. So sometimes it's a bit hard for doctors, especially junior doctors, to keep track of all the latest in the guideline. So what we do is to guide the junior doctors when they care for the heart failure patient, when they're admitted, we have a coordinated clinical pathway. This is a hard copy clinical pathway, which now in Singapore, we have actually make it into an electronic record system. But whether it's on paper form or electronic system, it doesn't matter. what is important is you need to have a clinical pathway. And the main reason for having a clinical pathway is to ensure that all the patients during their inpatient stay get the guided, the so-called recommended guideline therapy. And this is to guide non-heart failure specialists and the junior doctors. So in the pathway, you can see there will be things like discharge checklist to make sure that when a patient go home, the junior doctor will have to tick off, are they on the RAS inhibitor, are they on beta blocker, or are they on a MRA or SGLT2? So as the guideline change, you have to update the checklist as well, because it's very hard for a junior doctor to remember all this. They may forget. By having a checklist, at least we make sure that all these things are ticked, and we remind ourselves that we have to give the patient all this therapy before they get discharged. And not only that, there are other measures that we also will go through before the patient gets discharged. Like, have they been educated by the nurses before they go home? Do they know the importance of fluid restriction, low sodium diet? Have anyone spoken to them about stopping the smoking? So all this will also have to happen before they go home. And just a quick one that, unfortunately for us here in Asia, you can see that despite the fact that ACE, beta blocker, MRA are already a guideline for so many years, more than 20 years, unfortunately, the uptake of guideline therapy is still very low here in Asia. And this is just to show you that evidence-based drug, is it really achievable in Asian patient heart failure? And we had done a study in Singapore many years ago, and we find that the heart rate and the blood pressure was actually not a limiting factor for a lot of patients taking ACE and ARB or beta blocker. So that's why we started to have a pathway in Singapore and realized that a lot of time it's just doctors, the junior doctors, forget to give the drug or they are not reminded. And we've started using a pathway. You can see that in National Heart Center, almost taking beta blocker as example, almost 100% of patients were able to be prescribed on evidence-based drugs such as beta blocker before discharge. Same thing for ICD implantation, taking as an example device therapy, we find that those patients recruited into the heart failure program, they have a higher chance of getting a ICD implanted being offered to them compared to those patients not formally recruited in the heart failure program and just managed by general cardiology. So it's not just about medication. We also in the heart failure program do take note of the need for device and will recommend the appropriate patient the need for the device therapy. And this is another snapshot of what we do when the patient gets discharged. Within 3 to 4 days, usually they'll get a call from a heart failure nurse to check their signs and symptoms, make sure they're okay. At the same time, to check on their compliance as well. And if there is some complaint, the heart failure nurses can, over the phone, advise the patient on titration of some of the medication, especially a diuretic. And by doing so, we hope to reduce the chances of getting readmitted again. And since 2007, we have actually started a heart failure clinic run by the nurses and the heart failure pharmacists. The whole idea is so that the more stable heart failure patient can be seen by the heart failure nurses and pharmacists so that the cardiologists can see the sicker patient. And in this heart failure nurses clinic and run by them and the pharmacists, they can do the up titration of the medication. They also will do counseling for a patient, reinforce compliance, and of course, do the physical examination for the patient as well. And this is another snapshot of what we do for heart failure education. This is a checklist of what they should, the heart failure nurses will do with a patient. We will educate on smoking, asking them to quit smoking, if they're taking alcohol as well. Also advise on the stopping of alcohol. And of course, we also will advise them on the salt intake and the fluid intake as well. So quite a useful session for most of our patients, they find that. And these are just examples of some education handout that we give to patients that come in different languages. So for example, in nature, if you do this, you probably have to translate into Bahasa for the patient. And for all our patients, we advise them to go home with weighing scale and weigh themselves for the first few days or first few weeks after they get discharged. And any change in the weight more than 2 kg within 48 hours, we do ask them to contact us because that may be early sign of recurrent of a decompensated heart failure. And these are, and of course, importantly, we do give them a number to call. So we do have a heart failure handphone that the nurses will hold to a handphone. It's every Monday to Friday during weekday. during office hour around 8 o'clock in the morning to about 5, 6 p.m. in the evening. Some more example picture showing you one of our heart failure nurse going through the heart failure education with not just patient, but also with a caregiver as well. And in Singapore, I'm sure in Indonesia as well, the younger patient are big fan of iPhone and Android user. So we actually invented a mobile app for the patient as well. It was actually a project designed by our own heart failure team. And this heart failure mobile app is for heart failure patient with a lot of tools inside the app, where they can track their blood pressure, their heart rate, how much they drink, and the symptom tracker as well, and reminder for them, timer for them, that remind them to take their medicine. And these are more pictures showing why, it's a multidisciplinary physiotherapy. You can see these are patient post-LVAD, post-transplant, and heart failure patient as well, undergoing physiotherapies in both out and inpatient setting. And more recent year, because of COVID, it's harder for the patient to come to hospital. We also have what we call home rehab, where the patient can do a rehab at home, and through some Zoom kind of video, there was somebody, online kind of interaction where they can follow the instruction online for the rehab. Telemonitoring also becoming more and more important in recent years because of the impact of COVID. So we are offering telemonitoring for our patient as well. Some, especially elderly patients who may not have who may have somebody bring them to hospital, we now do telemonitoring with them as well. It can be actually through a phone call, or some of them who are more IT savvy, we do what we call video conference calls to Zoom as well with the patient. And we take pictures of medication and show it to our patient, so because a lot of heart failure patients, as you know, they have polypharmacy, taking a lot of different medication. So that's what we do as well. Take photo of commonly used drug, show it to a patient so that we go through with them which drug need to be titrated up or down. If not, a lot of time patients get confused. To them, all the tablets are just white tablets to them. And of course, because of the aging nation in Singapore, we now also starting to do what I call a home program, that is, instead of patient coming to us because you can see this elderly gentleman, it's very hard to make their way to hospital. We actually a home-based team that go to their home, and you can see all the drugs are so confused. So we actually send teams into the home to pack the medicine for them, to teach them what the medication, and by doing that, we hope to reduce, we hope to see a result of less admission to the hospital. Not sure in Indonesia when it's possible or not, because I think in Singapore, we're a small island, so it's easier. I know Indonesia, some of the patients may be staying very far from the city area, but it's something that you can consider. So again, showing you these are the different corners, different regions of Singapore that we had a home care program. But again, I do realize it's easier to do in Singapore because we're a small island. Of course, the last few parts, I'm going to just briefly touch on the ventricular assist device or the transplant program should be part of the heart failure program as well. And with a proper heart failure program, it will impact on a positive way in your LVAD and transplant program when you eventually start it. So you can see this is the result from National Heart Center from Singapore, that when we compare with the international standard, we're actually doing better than international standard. So it's not true that Asia here, our surgical so-called result have to be worse than US. Of course, we know that for some patients, eventually, despite all we do, they will still eventually demise, they'll pass away. So you do need to have some form of palliative care incorporated into your heart failure program as well. So again, just to summarize, the heart failure program have to be a multidisciplinary thing where, it is really right from the start, from a point of contact hospital to sending back to community, and then dealing with a continuous communication between the outpatient and inpatient team. And it's not just about taking medicine, it's also about improving the quality of life, functional status, their psychosocial factors is very important as well, and other things such as cognitive status and nutritional care. So if you can sum up, this is what a typical heart failure team should be. If you build something in Bandung, this is what you need. You need a surgeon, cardiologists, nurses, physiotherapists, essentially a bit like an Avengers team. Everybody have a special skill, and together as a team, you're very powerful. And we have seen that with a proper heart failure program, with proper medication right at a very early stage, the last few years, we have seen a slight drop in the number of patients needing devices such as LVAD, which is good news. And we have seen that, for some of the newer drugs, taking ARNI example, the widespread use of ARNI in our patient in heart failure in Singapore at a very early stage has really decreased the number of patients who need to be referred for LVAD. So among those patients with LVAD, referred for LVAD, actually about half of them will actually improve if you treat them medically with a newer drug. And you may say that, oh, that's not fair in Singapore, you are advanced economy, your GDP is one of the highest in the world, you're not a typical Asian country, you behave more like a Western country. True, I do admit that Singapore GDP is much higher than the rest of Asia, but I'm taking this is slide from Vietnam. I've been to Vietnam many years ago and helped them to set up a heart failure program in Ho Chi Minh City. And in this hospital that we set up the heart failure program in Vietnam, you can see that after the 3 months of starting a heart failure program, significant result, there's a reduction in the hospitalization and an improvement in the patient's symptom. And you can see that just 3 months, we see a great, uptake of the beta blocker that went up by a lot. And this is my last slide. This is summarize that, this whole heart failure program thing is just like, you want a good result, just F1, very efficacious. You can see that it's not just about cardiologists who are sitting probably in the car. You can see so many people, some filling up the petroleum, some filling up the changing the tire. Every single member of the heart failure team are equally important and must know your role, work in a very coordinated way to have a very smooth outcome. Thank you very much.
Eye-opening and full informative presentations. It's always interesting, I think, to discuss about heart failure and how to settle heart failure program and also advanced heart failure. As we know that until now in Indonesia, the treatment for advanced heart failure is still very limited. So it's very interesting for us to learn from you and to hear from your experience. And I'm pretty sure there's many questions in here from the audience and also from the panelists. So I would like to invite our panelists to give questions and also comments about setting heart failure, advanced heart failure program or heart failure program. Probably I would like to start from, I cannot see Dr. Erwin Nanto in here. Is he already here? Oh, Dr. Erwin is here. Okay. Dr. Erwin, Prof. Sim, Dr. Erwin is one of the senior cardiologists in Pajajaran University in my department. So I'm pretty sure he has some comments and also probably questions. Dr. Erwin.
Thank you, Dr. Sasmaya. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay.
Loud and clear, Dr.
Okay,
Erwin.
thank you. First, I'd like to say hello to Professor Sim David. It's nice to meet you again. Dear colleagues and friends, although we recognize that excellent care of patients with heart failure can occur in many venues, an advanced heart failure center, defined as a center that is able to offer heart transplant or at least durable left ventricular assist device, is required. Currently, there is a large mismatch between the number of patients with heart failure and the number of practicing advanced heart failure specialists in Indonesia. Given this supply and demand mismatch, the Indonesian Heart Association is preparing an advanced heart failure specialist program in Jakarta and Bandung. One key question facing practitioners is which patients should be referred to an advanced heart failure center, because there is less guidance for the overall approach to support optimal decision-making for referral of patients with heart failure to an advanced heart failure center. Professor Sim, which patient could benefit from having their care coordinated with an advanced heart failure center versus continuing ongoing care at their current site?
Yeah, so I think the referral criteria for referring to an advanced heart failure center depend on your resources. For example, when I first started the heart failure program many years ago, I was the only heart failure specialist. So as a single member in the team, with only one cardiologist, I can only see that many patients. So what I did was I limit to reduce ejection fraction patient and certain age group. I basically reduce it to less than 65 years old, because these are patients who are still suitable for heart transplant. These are still patients who are more likely to get a left ventricular assist device. But as my team grew, I now have more than 10 heart failure specialists in my team. We are now expanding to all age group, and regardless of reduced ejection fraction or preserved ejection fraction, we take on all the patients. And once the patient, after seeing us a few times, they are stable, we discharge them back to their referring doctor. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. It depends on your resources that you have. For a start, I think because if you are starting with only a few doctors, there's a limit of how many can see. I would say that I'll limit it to the younger patient. They are more likely to get more advanced therapy. Maybe you want to use age as a cutoff. And of course, we do not see patients with advanced liver cirrhosis. The patient already had advanced child C liver cirrhosis, or the patient already on end-stage renal failure needing dialysis. That group of patients, we probably won't think they will benefit from the heart failure program as well.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Sim. So basically, we can adjust the criteria based on our center capability, and then probably Dr. Erwin, any other comments?
Can I ask another question? Just one
sure.
other question?
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
Okay. Heart transplant remains the gold standard therapy for patients with advanced heart failure. However, heart transplant is constrained by the number of donor organs available. And to fill this gap, mechanical circulatory support has emerged, including the use of both short-term and durable devices. Prof. Sim, do you think it's reasonable that an advanced heart failure center only offer durable LVAD but not heart transplant?
The answer is definitely yes. There are many centers in the US where they don't do transplant anymore. They only do durable bed. And in many other centers, like even in National Heart Center Singapore, where we offer both transplant and a durable bed. But in theory, most of our patients are actually durable beds for many years. As you know, transplant is limited by the number of donors. You can't change that. But the durable beds, basically you want a durable bed, the company will just provide you one. So even though in Singapore, a lot of younger patients are, putting in a durable bed as a bridge to transplant, in theory, most of them are staying with a durable bed for many years. We have experience of supporting patients on durable beds for more than 10 years. In fact, some patients are so comfortable with the durable beds that when it's time for a transplant, they refuse the transplant. They don't want to go through another big operation, subjecting them to risk. They are really quite happy. So the quality of life, fortunately for the vets, with the advancement technology, is now very, very comparable to heart transplant. So it's globally and in Asia, we are seeing that more and more patients are actually opting for durable vets, because heart transplant, as you know, will always be limited by the number of donors.
Thank you. There's no other question, Dr. Sasmaya. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Erwin. But your last question is very important, actually. I also wanted everyone to know that heart failure center, sometimes we need heart transplant, but it's not I think we can still offer another advanced heart failure treatment, because in Indonesia, it's very challenging to start heart transplant in Indonesia, because we are a very huge country with islands and everything. So many things to deal with it. So thank you so much, Prof. Sim, for your answer, and also Dr. Erwin for your questions. And I see there's one question from the audience, but I will go to Dr. Dian first. Dr. Dian, do you have any comments or any questions to Prof. Sims?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hawani Sasmaya, moderator, for the opportunity. Thank you, Prof. David Sim, for your comprehensive lecture. Actually, I learned a lot from your brief lecture. And we hope that in the foreseeable future, Indonesia can initiate advanced heart failure management. But knowing Indonesian limitations, like maybe Dr. Erwinanto, my teacher also, and Dr. Hawani Sasmaya has said, I would like to ask several questions based your extensive experience also. First, actually, I'm very interested what your data regarding the beta blocker implementation in advanced heart failure. I want to ask you, would you try to implement all GDMT in the setting of HFrEF medication, HFrEF patients? As you know that from many trials, especially in HFrEF medication, they didn't include advanced heart failure patient in the inclusion criteria. As in our clinical setting practice, it is sometimes very challenging to initiate that kind of medication in advanced profile patient with several episodes of rehospitalization, decongestion, and also sometimes the patient need inotropic. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, agree you when the patient has very advanced heart failure, especially they come in with a low blood pressure, it is tough to start a lot of medication. So in that group of patient, maybe a beta blocker, they may not be able to tolerate beta blocker because of negative inotropic effect. ACE inhibitor ANI may be a problem as well because of low blood pressure. But fortunately for us, I think we have other options nowadays. I personally find that SGLT2 inhibitor do not reduce the blood pressure by a lot. Even the MRA, spironolactone, in the dose we use heart failure also doesn't reduce the blood pressure by a lot. So that's why there's some suggestion that maybe for this group of patients, we start with MRA and SGLT2 first. As they become better, then we start the beta blocker and ACE inhibitor. But I think the more important thing is, there are many more patients who are not at this stage, the advanced stage. Many more patients who present to us at the earlier stage of heart failure. That's why I keep on emphasizing it's important at the early stage of heart failure to treat them properly. The guideline now is the mandate that for all patients with HFrEF, the 4 pillars, that is ANI, beta blocker, MRA, and SGLT2 should be started early and possibly all at the same time. In my experience in National Heart Center, I would say that more than 90–95% of patients with heart failure, mild to moderate heart failure, we are able to start all 4 drugs before they get discharged. You see, the earlier you start the drug for them, the better for the patient. So heart failure program, you cannot keep on thinking of it as a patient who's very sick, who come to me just for transplant or LVAD. You have to also think of the bigger group of patients that have not reached that stage yet, you see. So that is what the heart failure program should do, outreach to this group of patients, the bigger group, the less advanced, so that they don't progress to advance. Because like I say, if you keep waiting for this group of very advanced patient to come to you, unfortunately, a lot of time by the time they are so sick that, the multi-organ failure, you really can't do much for them. Some of them are so sick that they don't even qualify for LVAD or transplant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Dian, any other comment or questions? No?
One last question, Dr. Hawani.
Sure.
Prof. Do you think with Indonesian limitation, Dr. Sasmaya have said we don't have LVAD now, we cannot do the heart transplant now. Maybe in Harapan Kita we still try, but it is very difficult, Prof. Do you think that certain inotropics such as levosimendan will be the best solution for our patient, advanced heart failure patients? Thank you.
Levosimendan is just another inotrope, just like any other trope. So you can give it may give temporary relief, but it's not going to solve your problem because in a few weeks time, a few months time, the symptoms are going to come back again. But levosimendan, it's just like you look at it, it's just like you're whipping the heart to work much harder, but at some time it will still give up, you see. So I don't think levosimendan there will be some indication for it, some use for it, but it will not solve your eventual problem because unlikely you give levosimendan and the effect can last for years, you see. Some patient effect can last for weeks, but eventually it will still come back. You see, I'm quite sure Hawani has some experience with levosimendan, and my current Indonesian fellow when he go to Jakarta, he will probably be also teaching all you what to do with levosimendan.
Yeah, actually, I think Yeah.
I just wanted to voice out that I know there's a lot of challenges that LVAD or that. Trust me, when I started the LVAD program many years ago, I also went through a lot of difficulty trying to convince the hospital, the ministry, everybody. But it's always the first step that you have to take, you see. And I think it is, given you have such a big population, there is definitely some young patient in your big country that will need some form of mechanical heart.
Yeah, because actually there are a few Indonesians that go to Singapore to get LVAD. So I'm pretty sure that one day we can start LVAD in Indonesia, probably, hopefully. Okay, and then I think there's one questions in here from the audience. Dr. Yogi asked about iron deficiency in heart failure, and I know that Prof. Sim is one of the researcher in the AFFIRM-HF trial. So I'm pretty sure you can give the explanations about how often should we check iron deficiency in heart failure patients, and about the benefit in giving IV iron supplementations.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Yeah, iron is also one of my tech topic. So we use a lot of intravenous iron in Singapore. And just to take note that oral iron has no role in heart failure. Oral iron has been shown not to work. It only gives the patient GI side effect. So ideally, I think all patients admitted for acute decompensated heart failure, you should check the iron level. It's not just checking the iron level, you always must add a ferritin. So if the ferritin level is low, the patient should get an intravenous iron. A dose of 500 milligram to 1000 milligram usually will last the effect up to 6 months to a year. So usually after giving iron, I will not check the iron level again until at least 6 months later. From our experience, most of the patients, it can last up to a year. And in the AFFIRM-HF trial, that's also what we find as well. And it is a very important component. Now already in major guidelines, is a class 2A indication. And the good thing about the current iron formulation, ferric carboxy maltose, it doesn't cause allergy. We use so many doses, so many thousands of doses in Singapore, we've not seen a single case of allergy. Something very simple that we even now offer is an outpatient infusion. So patients come to us in the clinic, we just give it to them. It's just a 10 to 15 minute infusion and they go home with that. So it's something that will help to improve the symptom of the patient as well. And of course, importantly, the AFFIRM-HF showed that it helped to reduce readmission as well.
Sure. Thank you so much, Prof. Sim. But unfortunately, in Indonesia, IV iron is a bit difficult to get because it's not covered by our national insurance or government insurance. Yeah, hopefully one day we can put it in the national. It can cover by government insurance. Okay. Then next question is from the audience as well. Anonymous, and unfortunately, but he asked about how much the impact and participation rate of cardiac rehabilitations for patients with HFrEF in your country, in Singapore. So about the cardiac rehabilitations.
Every patient that is referred to the heart failure program will start the inpatient rehab immediately. So during their few days stay, by day 2 or day 3, when the patient is much better, the physiotherapist will actually come in and start to walk the patient, make sure they're okay, everything. So it is literally 100%. So our heart failure program has a rehab component to it. So I would say that unless the patient, has some issue with mobility, wheelchair bound, I would say that almost every single patient will be recruited in the rehab program as well. So our heart failure program and rehab program are tied to each other. And the rehab exercise for the heart failure patient is catered to their needs. It's different for those patients for post-PCI.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Sim. And then probably the last 2 questions. The first one, can you please kindly explain it to us, the early signs of advanced heart failure? So in those group of patients, we can refer to another center that can manage patients with advanced heart failure.
Yeah. Okay, so this is quite easy. Obviously, the first one is symptom. If the patient, despite your treatment, persistently in NYHA class 3 to class 4, this group of patient definitely advanced. Another advanced red flag is that of patient who keep on coming into the hospital. Recurrent admission is also a sign of advanced, advanced heart failure. And then the other thing is cardiorenal syndrome, the kidney function going off, that group of patient, is also advanced. And also importantly, those patients who cannot tolerate a heart failure drug. That is previously they can tolerate the ACE and beta blocker. Now the blood pressure is starting to get lower and lower to the extent that you have to remove the drug. That group of patients are also advanced heart failure that you need to refer as well. So essentially worsening renal function, recurrent admission, NYHA class 3, class 4, hypotension, and the need to remove the drug, heart failure drug, because they cannot tolerate it. These are all signs of advanced heart failure that you need to refer early.
Sure, but probably but not all advanced heart failure patients need LVAD or heart transplant, because we need to run through again whether the patient is eligible or not for ventricular assist device or heart transplant. So probably when I become when I become your fellow, we usually also run through, right, Prof? Whatever, is there any etiology that can still be curable and everything, that we can still optimize the medical treatment and everything? And surprisingly few of patients that refer to your centers then become not that advanced that need a ventricular assist device or heart transplant.
Absolutely right. Yeah, you need to make sure the medicine is optimized. You need to make sure they're revascularized, or valvular issue, you need to correct that. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Okay, boss. Then I think the last thing that I want to ask you is my own questions actually. We know that poor compliance, it's always become a huge problem in heart failure treatment. So I just want to know, what is your center program to beat this huge problem in heart failure treatment, so we can learn from your center?
I think the nurses is a good source. The patient in Singapore somehow tend not to be so close to the doctors, but they tend to be closer to the nurses. They tell the nurses a lot of things. So the nurses can help, a good source of help for the compliance issue. They can serve as the middle person between patient and the cardiologist. And for me personally, when I see a newly diagnosed heart failure patient, I always take it a point to describe to them what can happen to them. I always tell them that heart failure can be actually worse than cancer, because if you use it to combat cancer, I think most patients get afraid. The reason why I think patients are not compliant is partly because they may have the wrong concept, the wrong impression that heart failure is something that can be cured. It's a very mild disease. But right from day one, if you set the tone right, you tell them that it's something that can become, can die within 5 years, and that will make people be afraid and then take note of, okay, I better be compliant to my medication.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. So basically, nurses have a huge role in terms of optimizing medical treatment in patients with heart failure. Okay, because of the limited of time, I need to end up these sessions. So I will briefly give a summary from our sessions. Basically, still, optimizing medical treatment is a very important thing in managing patients with heart failure. And then, of course, we need to prevent patients become advanced heart failure. But hopefully, advanced heart failure program, we can start it in Indonesia. Although it's challenging, but we need to start one day, and hopefully one day we can do it in Indonesia. And in the most important thing, teamwork. Teamwork is the most important thing to develop a good heart failure program. And also, I would like to say thank you so much to all panelists. Thank you so much, Prof. Sim, for your time and for giving and sharing your experience and your knowledge. It's really valuable for us. Thank you so much. And we hope all the audience also learn a lot from today's sessions. And please stay tuned to the next sessions. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Okay.